CNCI that Melissa worked on and the other studies, the current plan to develop a national cyber incident response plan is changing the format and the structure of where U.S. CERT's going to go, and I think in a very positive way. When I joined, Mike Witt and Jerry and those guys were frantically trying to get people. When I joined, we had 8 government civilians. We now are up to almost 60, with many more in the pipeline and looking for many more. But we have this huge fight that everybody in this room, working to challenge and move through. For those that heard the keynote this morning, in that triangle of CNO, U.S. CERT is the D. We're the national D. We work with Cybercom and NSA to, as they fight the .mil networks and the national security systems and things like that. We work with critical infrastructure and key resources like the group that Marcus works with. We work with state and local governments trying to help them with the multi-state ISAC and fight their battles on the state level, as well as helping the general population and providing information so they can help secure their home networks. So it's an ever-growing and dynamic challenge as that scope expands. There are folks here at this conference that we work with at the International Watch and Warning Network, which is a international, multinational, 18-country network, as well as organizations like FIRST, and taking lessons we learn and turning them to incident response, prevention, and mitigation to help secure, our national assets.
My name is Lynn Wells. I'm with National Defense University, which is in Washington, D.C. Many people don't realize that NDU actually is a conglomeration of 5 different colleges and 20 research centers. And I'd like to talk about 2 of those in the cyber area today. One is the Center for Technology and National Security Policy, and the other is what's called iCollege, or the Information Resource Management College. So CTNSP is doing a lot of work on international and interagency policy elements of cyber issues, working primarily with the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy's office at both classified and unclassified levels. And just to indicate some of the complexities of all this, so consider a case where the United States might deploy forces. And so you're going to have requisitions and things like that are going to be submitted through the unclassified NIPRNet networks. You're going to have command and control of those forces can be handled in classified .mil networks. If you're going to move things overseas, the State Department is going to have to negotiate clearances, country clearances, that over .gov. The FAA is going to have to handle air traffic control over some element of .gov. There's going to be a large part of .com domestically with UPS and things like that, internationally with companies like Maersk Lines. And so here you have a very important thread that runs through an important, arguably, national security interest, over which the Defense Department has only a fraction of the control. In fact, the government has only a fraction of the control. So, in fact, the United States, as a nation, only has a fraction of control. So how do you, pull together to build the public-private, whole-of-government, transnational partnerships in order to promote this kind of coordination? There's also a big issue that talks about the role, for example, of DHS in domestic activities, and should NSA play such a role in supporting DHS? Well, in fact, we don't have in the country the assets to duplicate NSA in terms of crypto mathematicians and things like that. There's going to have to be some way to leverage it. So building on what Mike Hayden said this morning about finding authorities, there's a whole set of authorities called Defense Support to Civil Authorities that has not really been brought to bear very much in the cyber domain so far. And I think that's an area we're going to see some more work on. Internationally, we've been working a lot with NATO and with various allies. And it's interesting to see the very different kinds of authorities that these close allies work under. In some cases, for example, the Ministries of Defense cannot do any advanced planning on a project until it becomes a military problem. And so as long as something is kind of rocking along below some sort of an instant horizon that says this is now a military problem, the MODs aren't allowed to do a lot of the planning that we kind of take for granted. So to wrap up then with the iCollege, iCollege teaches a series of certificate courses on things like computer CIOs, CISOs, and this is world-class capabilities are being taught. In addition, they have a series of closed laboratories that can do some very interesting research. There's a SCADA lab, supervisory control and data acquisition network that's sort of blocked off from the rest of the world that you can go play with. There's a series of independent networks that you can just take commercial off-the-shelf hacking tools and see just what kind of consequences would be, particularly bringing in bureaucrats who are not used to seeing this and showing them just what can be done in fairly benign environments. And finally, the college is the head of the Federal Virtual Worlds Consortium, doing lots of work in a whole series of virtual worlds. So there's a lot of things going on related to cyber at National Defense University. A lot of it, I think, is tied. One of the nice things we can do is tie fairly closely to policymakers without being part of the sort of action officer bureaucracy per se. So I look forward to follow-on discussion.
So what I'd like to do is just get if you can raise your hand, how many of you are working for the government or are working supporting the government? Just a show of hands. Okay. So what I'd like to do is provide some context for some of the discussion we're going to dive into, especially when we start digging into cybercrime and cyber conflict, is to kind of set the stage of how policy gets made, especially as it relates to cyber. And I'd like to have Melissa kind of provide that background and how does policy get formulated? How do you bring together all the different departments and the moving parts to try to move the ball forward?
Thanks, Jerry. You'd be shocked, I think, of how policy really is made in across the executive branch. The White House convenes interagency policy committees, which are there's 3 different types of committees that are formed. One is at let's say 3 levels down in an organization. One is 2 levels down at the deputy level. So if you saw Secretary Lute speak yesterday, that would be at the deputies level. And then there's another meeting that's at the principals level. So those people who are direct advisors to the president. And for cybersecurity, it actually sits within both Homeland and National Security Councils. And so it gets a broader swath of all of the executive branch. When there's a policy issue that needs to be discussed, it first starts at the 3 levels down at an interagency policy committee, and those people around the table debate the topic, and everybody brings their particular perspective to the table. We look for consensus, because if there really isn't consensus on the approach to take, then you need to have an arbitrator in the overall policy-making process. If there's consensus on what to do, and I'll just use perhaps an example that Rich Marshall here is working on the education initiative, and how do you start to raise national awareness and whose responsibility is that? How do you start to get to a common personnel structure within the Office of Personnel Management so that everybody's knowledge, skills, and abilities are actually measured the same way, whether you're at the Department of Commerce or the Department of Defense, et cetera. And there are a number of other areas, but we had consensus at the Interagency Policy Committee, so then it goes up to a Deputies Committee, and we present to the deputies and say this is the approach or the policy that we want to move forward to, and here's the lead, and if it has a cost associated with it, you have to address the costs associated with it as well. At the table then with costs as OMB, you usually have every constituent within the White House, which you'd be surprised. You have elements of the Vice President's office, Office of Science and Technology Policy, and all of these different constituents. So you could have 26 different departments and agencies and actually 12 other offices that are representing of the White House campus. If there's consensus from there, you move up to the Principals Committee and along with the President, and then it becomes the policy for the executive branch that then everybody has to execute against.
I just have a quick question, Melissa. How long does it take to go from layer 3 to it's now policy?
So let me give everybody perspective on CNCI, because we didn't follow any of the rules for CNCI. And I think that that's important because we moved at warp speed for policy and a national strategy and funding for CNCI, which most people who know that. So when CNCI, we got the tasker in April of '07, I was asked to form an interagency group to get consensus and present a strategy to the President of the United States in 6 weeks. And I convened all of the intelligence community because at the time I was in the DNI, and we invited Department of Justice and all of those entities, Department of Homeland Security, that we did not have the purview over. We developed a strategy that was looking at the 4 different attack vectors, insider threat, proximity access, coming through the internet, and supply chain, and how does offense inform defense. We formed a strategy in 8 weeks. We presented it to the full cabinet at the end of June, and literally a week later we got formulated into the whole interagency process. It still moved at pretty much warp speed because we briefed the President in August. He endorsed the whole strategy in September and told OMB to fund it, and it went forward as part of the President's budget in January of '08. And that 6 months, we had an entire ship movement of the entire executive branch and a fair amount of funding that was all new money, not offsets, to the executive branch. Normally, the process is very slow. And as you're actually watching right now, there hasn't been very much new policy created in the last 18 months, and because of lots of reasons. But policy normally takes 2 to 3 years to formulate, and CNCI was a very special time, and we formulated major policies across all of the executive branch in less than 6 months.
Dr. Wells?
Just if I could just note, the team that Melissa put together to pull this, and the reports that were generated across the government remain to this day to be probably the most interesting set of interagency documents I've ever read. I actually look forward to the monthly or quarterly, whatever, compendia of the work that's being done in this space, and I've just never seen anyone do it as well as she did it. It was very impressive.
So, with that said, on the regarding cyber policy, how does industry get involved in that process? I mean, what kind of input or opportunity does industry have to maybe inject their thoughts or their into that policy-making process, especially when you're on a rapid timeline like with CNCI?
I think it's critical that when policy is defined, that you bring in the practitioners, the CISOs from private industry, the entrepreneurs, emerging growth companies. Without that balance, it's hard to define a policy that is applicable and timely. And with the technology and the internet, it moves at warp speed, so technology is outpacing the policy. And one of the things that I've seen succeed in terms of bringing communities together is to identify those leaders within San Francisco or Chicago, New York, that work with the local policy folks. For example, in San Francisco, the Bay Area Council has an initiative. They brought in numerous CISOs to help evangelize and shape policy relative to 1386, which is a notification breach law. There's approximately 42 or so individual state laws, and their goal is to support a federal law, but they're doing that in conjunction with policymakers and again, the practitioners. And it's incremental.